made for the next debate, there will also be suspensions between each debate. I remind members participating physically and virtually that they must arrive for the start of debates in Westminster Hall. Members are expected to remain for the entire debate. I must also remind members participating virtually that they must leave their camera on for the duration of the debate and that they will be visible at all times, both to each other and to us in the Boothroyd room. If members attending virtually have any technical problems, they should email the Westminster Hall Clerk's email address, which is westminsterhallclerks@parliament.uk. Members attending physically should clean their spaces before they use them and as they leave the room. I would also like to remind members that Mr. Speaker has stated that masks should be worn in Westminster Hall. Members attending physically who are in the latter stages of the call list should use the seats in the public gallery and move on to the horseshoe when seats become available. Members can only speak from the horseshoe where there are microphones. Tom Hunt to move the motion.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I beg to move that this House does now consider E-Petition 266770 relating to grouse shooting. My role on the Petitions Committee, which I take very seriously, as does every other member of the Petitions Committee, is to ensure that the petitions that get over 100,000 signatures get debated and that the arguments put forward by those on the petition are heard and that issue is thoroughly debated. So that is what I stand here today charged with doing. A member of Parliament for an urban constituency. Grouse shooting is not an issue I know a huge amount about. And actually, it's not only is it not an activity in Ipswich, it's not an activity in Suffolk. There is no grouse in Suffolk. However, I am here today. So I'd also thank all of the 965,000 people who have signed this petition. And of course, it has taken it a while to get it debated, but we are here. And the petition calls for a ban on grouse shooting. Willful blindness is no longer an option. Chris Packham, Ruth Tingay, and Mark Avery from Wild Justice believe that intensive grouse shooting is bad for people, the environment and wildlife. Grouse shooting, in terms of people, petitioners argue that grouse shooting is economically insignificant when contrasted with other real and potential uses of the UK uplands. They provide some more details in terms of the environment. Moorburn impacts negatively upon climate change, and drainage leads to flooding and erosion. Wildlife, the whole-scale culling of all predators and mountain hares has a disastrous effect on the ecology of these areas, and the industry is underpinned by a criminal tradition of raptor persecution, which shows no sign of abating. It's time to provide an opportunity to implement immediate, legislative and meaningful measures to address this abhorrently destructive practice. So that is in essence what the petition is calling for. For those different reasons, they would like to see grouse shooting banned. Of course, there was a debate, I think it was 5 years ago, October 2016. There was a debate on this same issue, and I had a look at this debate, and I read the Hansard, and to be honest, I don't think the issues really seem to have changed much. I think probably today we will hear the same arguments put forward for those who want to ban it, and probably the same arguments put forward by those who wish it would continue. And I appreciate also that for many colleagues here today, this is an issue they feel very strongly about, and as an issue it would be much more live in their constituencies. So I will open this debate, facilitate what I hope is a scintillating discussion about this issue, but one in which I feel less able to inject personal experience and understanding into because I've never been grouse shooting and I don't have a constituency where it happens. But in terms of some of the other sides of the argument, I thought it was only fair. I mean, obviously, read out the call from Chris Packham and the others who set up this petition, but there are many people who put forward different arguments, and many make some economic arguments for some of the benefits that grouse shooting does bring. Of course, the moorland management and the effort and the expertise that goes into preserving these complex habitats, of course, many landscapes that are very pleasing to the eye and which generate significant amounts of tourism. My understanding is that the North York Moors alone had, often has over 8 million visitors a year, which can be, to my mind, that doesn't seem to be an insignificant economic benefit, but a significant economic benefit. My understanding is that grouse moor owners spend over £50 million every year on preserving these complex environments. Yeah. And then in terms of 42,500 work days every year are generated through this activity, and that 1,500 full-time jobs are tied to it, about 700 directly, about 800 indirectly. And of course, it's also worth bearing in mind that these are isolated upland communities, so one has to wonder what else would generate that level of job, because these are, as I say, isolated communities. So of course there's that economic benefit, and also seems from my research that they often bring people together, and there's a social impact to the economy, and there's actually lower levels of loneliness in these isolated rural areas where grouse shooting happens compared with other areas. So I also, in terms of there's no evidence that I came across that said that an alternative use would promote better natural capital than the unique environment that we're dealing with here. So, I mean, I don't know what the alternatives, I don't really hear the alternatives for what would happen in these areas apart from grouse shooting, Madam Chairman, because, I mean, if rewilding could be one of the things that could be suggested, and we could have pumas and lynxes and honey badgers running wild in these areas, I mean, perhaps that'd be quite an interesting spectacle. So maybe actually tourism would continue to be a popular thing, because we'd like to see how that happens and how that is good for the... Yes, I'll give way.
Very good. Very good point. And lots of people think about woodland and think it's a place where you get lots of habitat for lots of wildlife. That isn't always the case. Coniferous woodland is almost devoid of wildlife. And that's what people point to, reforestation or forestation of these areas, which actually increases the amount of CO2 emitted by 4 to 6 times per hectare compared to moorland.
That's a very good point from somebody who clearly has a level of understanding that I could only wish to have on this topic. But I just would conclude in saying that it seems that from looking at it from my angle, it does seem that the environmental argument there's arguments for and there's arguments against. But for me, the economic argument is unchallengeable from what I can see in terms of the real economic, tangible benefits that the activity brings to the lives of thousands of people in that particular area. So, in short, I look forward to this debate. I understand that many people feel strongly about it. I don't know if this debate will really advance things much, because I predict, I might be wrong, that this debate will go in very much the same direction as the one 5 years ago. But I'm pretty sure in 2 or 3 years' time we'll be back here again, because it seems as though there are some individuals who are incredibly motivated by wanting to stop this practice. I mean, it does. I fear that for some this is more about a dislike of perceived posh people having fun more than it is about any actual logical arguments about the pros and cons. And we wouldn't want that, Madam Chair. I mean, we wouldn't want that. We wouldn't want that kind of class warfare. So I open this up to the floor and look forward to a debate.
The question is that this House has considered E-Petition 26770 relating to grouse shooting. Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Ms McDonough. It's always a pleasure to see you in the chair. And I did take part in the 2016 debate, which I think it was fair to say was probably not the best-natured debate that we've had in this place. It is an issue that arouses strong feelings. But I do want to thank the honourable member from Ipswich for at least trying to do justice to both sides of the argument, because I actually wrote to both the Speaker and the then Chair of the Petitions Committee after the last debate, because it was basically that the person supposedly speaking on behalf of the petitioners just I felt sneered at them, spent the whole time rubbishing their arguments. And I think that just to be respectful to the petitioners, if you do take on the role of speaking, you at least ought to sort of do a neutral job in outlining what they're about. And I think the honourable member did do that. I think he slightly spoilt it at the end with the posh people argument, because I think that was something that was very much levelled at opponents of fox hunting, wrongly I think, but I don't think that is the case, and I think certainly the people involved in wild justice are absolutely passionate about conservation and are very genuine in their concerns about the impact of driven grouse shooting. So this petition was interrupted by the 2019 general election. Just after that election, I joined the Petitions Committee for a few months, and we were trying to get this a hearing for the petition to be debated, but obviously COVID, I think we even had a date in the diary, and then COVID put paid to any possibility of that. And I had the pleasure, I think it was a very good move by the chair of the Petitions Committee to ask me to interview Chris Packham instead. So there is a transcript which people can read on the House of Commons Petitions Committee website of me putting questions to him that we perhaps could have debated back then. And I'm going to refer to quite a bit of what Chris says in that interview during the course of my speech today. I have to say, I mean, Chris has had a huge amount of abuse for it, speaking out on these issues, from dead animals tied to the door of his house, death threats and so on. And I know that whenever I speak about shooting issues on social media, there were certain people, there was a guy that sent me pictures of bacon sandwiches and spare ribs every day for 11 days and then just got bored because I wasn't paying any attention to him. But it does get quite nasty, and I think Chris has been on the receiving end of a lot of that, which I think is very unfortunate. And I think particularly when you look at his work with young naturalists, and particularly those from neurodivergent backgrounds, he's done brilliant work, and I pay tribute to him for that. So in the interview, as I said, the transcript's available. Chris started by talking about the fact that we're now facing dual climate and ecological emergencies, and that people are increasingly worried about what he describes as catastrophic biodiversity loss, and that driven grouse shooting produces a very unhealthy landscape. So that is the background context to the concerns. He was asked by me what he thought of the government response. So when the petition gets to 10,000 signatures, there's a brief written government response. And he said he was going to be polite, but then he described it as pathetic and derisory, and showing a depth of ignorance and willful blindness that we didn't want or expect, which if that's him being polite, I'd like to see what he really thinks. But in the written response, he did say that at least the government acknowledges the importance of the peatlands, the moorlands habitat, that our uplands have 75% of the world's remaining moorland and about 13% of the world's blanket bog. And I think people don't actually realise how, not unique, but how unusual the UK is in terms of having that as a natural resource. And we should be managing this precious habitat, not for the dubious benefits of grouse shooting, but in the interests of biodiversity and of ecosystem services, so as valuable carbon sinks, offering flood protection and so on.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Would you not agree that those two are not mutually exclusive?
Well, I think I might go on to say why I think it's problematic in the way they're managed. They shouldn't, I mean, it's one of the problems that I think the campaigners supporting this petition have had is they've got to the point where they're saying the only answer is a ban on driven grouse shooting, because people who manage the moorlands haven't been prepared to meet them halfway, haven't been prepared to address some of the issues, for example, about the hen harrier persecution or the burning of the heather and so on. And I think they've made clear in previous comments. Yeah.
Very grateful. Just on hen harriers, is you aware that in 2006 there was 50 hen harrier chicks, 2013 0 hen harrier chicks, last year 60 hen harrier chicks. It's not right to say. We need to look at the evidence here. It's really important we do look at the evidence and don't move to emotive arguments. It's really important we look at the facts. This should not accept there is work going on to improve hen harrier breeding.
There's work going on, but it might take me, I probably can't immediately locate in the transcript the figures. Yeah, I think maybe it's here. The hen harrier population declined across the UK and the Isle of Man by 24% between 2004 and 2016, with just 575 pairs remaining. Estimates suggest sufficient habitat and food availability to support a population of over 2,650 pairs. In England, we know there's available habitat for more than 300 pairs, but yeah, I think we're down to, as you say, a very small number of, yeah.
But they did decline from 2006 to 2013. Now they're on the rise again. It's really important we do look at the positive work that's going on in these areas rather than just thinking it's all about the way that moors are managed.
No, it's, the figures are nowhere near where they should be in terms of what we could support. And it's not just what the honourable member saying they're going up from a very small base. And as I say, it's nowhere near where we should be. But the fact is, this raptor persecution is illegal. It shouldn't be happening, and it's happening on the grouse moors. So regardless of what the numbers are, even the death of one hen harrier is illegal, and it shouldn't be part of grouse moor management, which is the point I think we shouldn't lose sight of. It's not just a conservation measure, it's the fact that it is illegal to do this. As I said, we shouldn't, in terms of, protecting this habitat, they could act as valuable carbon sinks, they could offer flood protection and so on. I suspect the Honourable Member for Sheffield Hallam may have something more to say about the role in flood protection, but certainly when I've been to those areas after the floods of 2015-16 and when I've spoken to people after the more recent floods in those areas, there is real concern about the impact that the management of the moorlands is having. A healthy upland habitat should, as Chris Packham says, be covered with trees, blanket bog, deep layers of sphagnum moss, which act like a great sponge, deep peat, storing all of that water. And the management of grouse moors directly militates against this, with the burning of the heather, the illegal raptor persecution, as I mentioned, the extermination of mountain hares. Chris Packham also spoke about weasels and stoats caught up in spring traps, crows caught in cage traps, foxes caught in snares, and endangered protected species accidentally caught up too, and about the use of medicated grit and the leaching of toxins from lead shot into the groundwater. And the bottom line is, all these measures to protect the grouse are not in the interests of conservation, it's just so that the grouse can then be shot. And just as I don't accept the conservation argument, I don't accept the economic argument either. As Chris Packham says, the government has never quantified this. The lack of data, the lack of transparency means we can't say with any degree of accuracy how much money is going where, who is benefiting, and who is not benefiting. He said that there are some the figures from Scotland. There's been a bit more information released, and he said that if I think if Scotland was seen to be the size of Ben Nevis, the economic benefit from grouse shooting there would be the size of a small banjo. And that seems to be the official interpretation. I don't know why they brought banjos into it. I don't know the difference between a small banjo and a large banjo. But he's saying that given that the area of land given over in Scotland to grouse shooting is between 12 to 18% of land, you could produce something far more worthwhile than the equivalent of a small banjo in terms of economic benefit from that area. I hope the Honourable Member's going to explain why the banjo comes into it.
I'm not sure about banjos, but the premise that she gave before was that grouse management is there for shooting birds. I would say that that is not the case. Shooting is part of the environmental process that is going on. People who engage themselves in grouse shooting involve themselves in environmental management. And to just kill all the grouse would mean there would be no grouse next year, very simply. The process has to be managed for the environment.
I don't accept that, except that if you look at the way the moors are managed, it is to create the largest possible of numbers, to avoid anything that might be a threat to the grouse or any natural predators that are there and destroying a lot of other wildlife at the same time. And this isn't so that people can sort of stalk through the undergrowth with their gun in the way that you might think of the country sport of shooting. This is so that busloads of people can come in and they stand there at butts and then they just shoot, and it's very much a numbers game. And I wouldn't say that there's anything to do with the numbers are there. The birds wouldn't be there in those numbers if they weren't artificially managed, in the same way that you get the imported pheasants and partridges when it comes to that form of shooting. They are there to be shot, and I said I think the way that it is managed is related to that intensivity and the sheer numbers they want to produce, rather than it being about any concern for the actually conserving the natural habitat. As I said, we just don't have the numbers. I don't know if the Minister will come up with numbers to tell us who is benefiting from this and what contribution it makes. So in conclusion, I think we need to see
The Honourable Lady asks who's benefiting. Well, it's quite clear. I've got gamekeepers in my constituency, hundreds of people employed in the broader hospitality sector, which is supported by shooting. Those are the people who are benefiting. If the Honourable Lady would like to meet some of the people who benefit economically from this activity, then I'd be delighted to host her in my constituency so she could actually meet some of the people involved in the industry.
I suspect they're not benefiting anywhere near to the extent that the people who own the land, many of whom are extremely wealthy, are raking in money from this. If you see the amount that is charged for some of the packages for people to come to these areas to take part in shooting days, I suspect not an awful lot of that trickles down to the local economy. As I said, I'm trying to wind up, Ms McDonough, I don't think... I think we need to see more action from this government. It's very disappointing that the government refused to accept Labour's amendment to the Environment Bill on the burning of heather and peatlands. Again, I think we'll hear more about that from the Shadow Minister. I don't believe the measures introduced on the 1st of May by the government go far enough. I would note the comments of the Committee on Climate Change in its latest report that was released last Wednesday, that there's an increasingly urgent need to restore degraded upland peatland and to manage it more sustainably. And I'd be interested to hear from the Minister as to what she thinks can be done, because obviously that comment from the Committee on Climate Change was post any action that's been taken by the government to date. And I hope that in the light of what the Committee on Climate Change has said, she'll consider talking to her colleagues in the Lords and strengthening the Environment Bill to address that concern.
Thank you. Can I just point out that there are a great deal of members who wish to speak in this debate. If you make and take interventions, some of those people are going to be excluded, and we would hope to get everybody in. And we would also hope to keep a good atmosphere in this debate and not to replicate what I understand was the last debate on this issue. Okay, Robert Goodwell.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs McDonough. Can I start at the outset by saying that I believe that to ban grouse shooting will be an act of environmental, ecological and economic vandalism, not to mention a gastronomic disaster for many people in this country. 2/3 of the North Yorkshire Moors National Park is in my constituency. My honourable friend from Thirsk and Malton has the bulk of the rest. And indeed, 79% of the North Yorkshire Moors and the Pennine Special Protection Areas are grouse moors. So these are habitats which are recognised officially as needing protection. When the North Yorkshire Moors National Park was delineated in 1952, why was it chosen? It wasn't chosen because it was some environmentally devastated area that needed changing. It was chosen precisely because it is the way it is now. And the management of that national park over the years has been to preserve it in the way it is. And part of that has been the way that the uplands are managed for grouse and the other species that benefit. The habitat on heather moorland, on dry heathland moorland, which much of the North Yorkshire Moor is very, very fragile. It's rarer than rainforest. And indeed, 75% of Europe's heather moorland is in the UK. Now, you can't rear grouse in the same way you might rear pheasants and partridge and release them. The only way you can get grouse to breed is by creating the environment for them to actually breed. And that fragile ecosystem really needs management to ensure that not only the grouse, but also other red-listed species such as black grouse, lapwing, skylark, curlew, and the UK's smallest bird of prey, the merlin, can breathe and survive. Indeed, merlin numbers have doubled on grouse moors over the last 20 years, whereas elsewhere in the country they have halved. The Honourable Lady from Bristol East mentioned hen harriers and other raptors. 100 years ago, there was no hen harriers in the UK at all. But since that time, the latest survey, I think in 2016, showed that there were 545 territorial pairs. And indeed, my honourable friend from Thirsk and Malton said that last year 60 had fledged. But in terms of other raptors, in 1963 there were 360 pairs of peregrines. There are now 1,750. 20 years ago there were 160 pairs of red kite. There are now 4,400. And buzzards, there are 75,250 pairs, a six-fold increase. And indeed, I was recently in my own area, and so I think 13 buzzards circling in the sky. So much has been the effect of the way that the countryside is managed and, I must say, the legislation that has outlawed the persecution of these raptors. So, why is it that we're having so many of these species, the lapwings, and I know that the Minister and I spoke about lapwings and remarked that there weren't many on a moor she was there in August. I mean, the lapwings come and they breed in the spring and then go back to their coastal areas. So it is important that we have these areas for birds to breed. So why is it so important that we do that? Well, we need to control predators like foxes, but we also need to ensure that the way that the moorland is managed through rotational burning prevents the outbreak of wildfires. And indeed, on Saddlemoor Moor, there were 10 days of fires, and indeed a parliamentary question asked by my noble friend in the other place, Lord Botham, get the answer that there were 72 times more CO2 emitted over the last 5 years than previously, with 294,000 tonnes of CO2 resulting from wildfires. As the Honourable Member from Ipswich said at the start, it is very important for the rural economy that we have grouse shooting, not just for the actual gamekeepers and those involved in that, but the hospitality that supports people when they come, the money they put into the rural economy, but also the fact that were it not for the mixture of tall and short heather, succulent young heather, sheep farming would become increasingly difficult on those uplands. Finally, game is a very sustainable food. In fact, the other day we found a grouse at the bottom of our freezer, which we very much enjoyed. In fact, one of the problems during lockdown has been that the demand for game has plummeted, which has meant that, for example, the requisite number of deer have not been culled this year. There are 3 million deer in the country, and that's causing a real threat to forestry, particularly in Scotland, I understand. So it's important that we have this low-fat, healthy, natural food produced in an outdoor environment, which I would argue is certainly better both for the environment and people's health than a chicken reared in a very intensive broiler house. So in conclusion, Mrs McDonough, the only way that we can protect the environment, the ecosystem and the rural economy is to support grouse shooting and the benefits it brings. Thank you.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can I first of all apologise? I was doing a bill in the chamber, so I just couldn't be here. I've run the whole way over, so I'm a wee bit short of breath. Forgive me. Okay. I'm not still as young as I used to be, so running is a wee bit more difficult. But anyway, can I say, first of all, what a privilege it is to speak on this issue. I'm very, very pleased to... the last time we had a debate in this in Westminster Hall, the honourable gentleman who spoke before me for Scarborough and Whitby, and I spoke in this very same debate. It was a real pleasure to be back again to do that. I am declaring interest as a member of BASC of the Countryside Alliance Ireland and Country Sports Ireland as well. I'm a country sports enthusiast. I'm also a conservationist. Indeed, I believe you can't be a country sports enthusiast without being a conservationist, because I believe they both march hand in hand together to deliver what we want, and why this matter is an important one to speak on. There is no doubt that degraded peatlands do emit carbon. However, it is estimated that 94% of UK peatland emissions come from lowland peatlands and not grouse moors. So I think it's a very distinct balance to make between what's happening in the grouse moors and what happens in other peatland. In fact, drainage and agricultural practices cause most peatland emissions. Grouse moors are estimated to store up to 35% of the UK's peatland carbon, meaning their emissions are well below other land uses. You will see a far greater biodiverse habitat of species on a managed grouse moor than you would in other areas of moorland which are not actively managed. I've never, Madam Chair, ever been on a grouse moor in Scotland. I've never shot a grouse. I've often wished I had that opportunity. Maybe sometime that will come my way. One way or the other, I'm here to support those who are involved in grouse shooting, and I do feel very, very strongly, which is why I wanted to be here, to support our shooting comrades in relation to that. 2,592 full-time jobs in England, Scotland and Wales on the moorlands. 1,772 actively managing the moors. The economic value per year is 67 million. And then we have those who come from tourism, those from the EU and from America, who come to shoot on the moors and take advantage of that as well. So we have a very, very successful grouse shooting moors across England, Wales and also in Scotland. I'm very interested to learn about the York University peatland study, which was funded by DEFRA for 5 years and now funded by over 20 organisations, including BAASC, Yorkshire Water, United Utilities and the Moorland Association. I'm very pleased to see the Minister in her place, and I always look forward to what the Minister says, but I know that her response to today on this issue will be one that's well worth listening and well worth taking on board, and will answer many of the issues that maybe those who perhaps have concerns can be addressed. Discussing the pros and cons of different types of management, there's a strongly presented argument against a burning ban on blanket bog. It outlines that burning should remain part of the overall toolkit, and is concerned about the negative impacts mowing may cause, including increased methane emissions. A kilogram of methane warms the planet as much as 96 times more than a kilogram of carbon dioxide over a 20-year time frame. These are the facts that have to be considered when it comes to this petition that we have before us, and why it's important to get the balance on where we are. I can understand concerns over upland fires. And yes, my opinion that we need more research in the data. Controlled burning causes 68% of upland wildfires, and yet only 10% of upland fires have precise data on cause of fire. Again, it poses a question. The study specifically states care is needed in interpreting these findings given the small proportion of overall fires, where a specific cause is assigned and potential bias and subjectivity in these assessments. According to the same report, only 8% of all upland wildfires occur in the autumn and winter months, when the bulk of controlled burns are undertaken. And again, I would commend all of those who are involved in the management of moors and the controlled way and the very, very important and cautious way that they do that. 92% of wildfires occur during the spring and summer months. The study calls for a universal categorization method and better recording, and I support this as well, because I think it's important that we get it right. Controlled vegetation burning to reduce the fuel load and protect peatlands from wildfire is an essential tool used across the globe. In fact, recent research from the USA showed controlled burns can reduce wildfire risk on peatland across the globe. Again, the evidential base, I would suggest, Madam Chair, is such to support the controlled burning of parts of the moor, so that the moor can regenerate and provide the food that is necessary for the wildlife that is there. BASC and the Moorland Association are part of the England and Wales Wildfire Forum, and gamekeepers play a key role in preventing and tackling wildfires with their local knowledge and specialist equipment. The fact is that the fires that happened a few years ago, Madam Chair, in parts of England, it was the local gamekeepers, it was those involved in the management of the moors who were out to the fore and giving the support that was needed at that time. And many of those there worked sometimes 24-hour shifts. So I think they should be commended for all they've done. I finish with this, Madam Chair. We all have a part to play in making the most of our grouse moorlands. And it's right that these questions are asked, but it's also right that the research work done to ensure that we are doing our best to conserve and make the most of the phenomenal natural habitat that we've been granted. I believe that the habitat and the wildlife that we have today, we have them in trust for those who come after. So it is my reasoned belief that controlled moorland management is an integral part of this. I support those who shoot the moors, those who manage the moors, those who make sure that the tourism potential of £67 million a year is harnessed and delivers some almost 3,000 jobs that are very, very important, and gives up large amount of tourism potential as well. So I wanted to put that on record and give my support for those who ensure that the grouse moors will live long after this old boy's away, and maybe after my children and grandchildren are away as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert, David. David Simmons will be contributing virtually.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, I'd like to declare my membership of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Shooting and Conservation, though like the members for Ipswich and Strangford, I've never personally been grouse shooting. Ruislip, Northern and Pinner has no grouse moors, but it's certainly home to many people with an interest in animal welfare, and also to a business that supports residents who enjoy shooting as a recreation, albeit with no live animals involved locally. And as a consequence, I've had the opportunity to hear from constituents on both sides of the debate today. It seems to me, Mrs. McDonough, that humans have shaped our environment enormously over many centuries. And as a consequence, all of us living today have a responsibility to protect and enhance our environment, whether or not we approve of what previous and indeed future generations might have planned for it. Our moorlands, many of our fishing rivers, our natural environment has been shaped by generations of human activity. And the biodiversity that we have around us today is the result of those actions. But one of the issues cited most often in this debate is the issue of heather burning. But this habitat management is required if we want to see the habitat continue to prosper. And there are clearly two major benefits from burning. The first being that it promotes the new growth of heather and grass, which supports a wide range of wildlife, in addition to grouse, so curlew, lapwing, golden plover, as well as deer and hares. But even more important from a human perspective is the prevention of wildfires that a number of members have alluded to. And back in 2003, for example, a wildfire on the National Trust Bleaklow destroyed more than 2,000 acres of rare habitat and all the heather on the neighbouring 2,500 acre moor. And the sad reality is that the CO2 levels, a climate change issue, being released from wildfires has increased dramatically in the last 5 years. And if we want to prevent them, if we want to reduce those emissions, then controlled fire breaks are a necessary part of our toolkit. So the practice has many different names depending on where we are in the country. But the idea behind prescribed burning is that it's a quick burn, which removes the canopy, does not affect the underlying peat or soil layer, which is so important to the biodiversity of our environment. The other theme that runs through this debate, Madam Chair, is the feelings that we have about animal welfare related issues and the distaste many people feel about the idea of killing live creatures for fun. And whilst I share that sentiment, I also recognise that here in the UK and throughout the world, different forms of hunting are not just an essential part of good husbandry of nature, they also underpin the funding that enables conservation and biodiversity efforts to proceed, both in the United Kingdom and across the world. And where we as humans have created an ecosystem, as we are debating here, we have a responsibility to manage it. And those proposing bans on others' actions that they personally dislike need also to consider who will undertake, who will pay for the husbandry of those animal populations, so that familiar problems such as parasite infections, out of control predation, do not simply replace one unpleasant fate with another. So put bluntly, Mrs. McDonough, the ecosystem we've created requires the management of animal numbers. And in my view, much better to do so in a way that supports the economy of that ecosystem, that animals killed with a purpose of being eaten, contributing to the conservation and the welfare of that animal population, than abdicate our responsibility to the detriment of biodiversity and animal welfare at home and abroad. So in conclusion, Mrs. McDonough, we need to consider the net effect of the decisions that we take on our environment. And it seems clear to me that the ban which has been put forward is likely to produce a net disadvantage to our environment, a net disadvantage to our biodiversity, and must therefore be opposed.
Thank you. We will also be joined by Greg Smith virtually.
Thank you, Mrs. McDonough. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and also a pleasure to follow my honourable friend for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, who made an argument I entirely agree with far more eloquently than I could. Like him, I'm also a member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Shooting and Conservation, as well as being a member of BASC and the Countryside Alliance. Before I get into the main points I wish to make, I'd like to associate myself with the comments that my honourable friend for Scarborough and Whitby made about the value of game meat as a healthy meat, a healthy food choice. And whilst perhaps a grouse that has been lingering at the bottom of his freezer for some years is not the best way to be introduced to the wonderful taste of grouse, I would heartily encourage everybody who hasn't tried this tasty, wonderful meat to do so. Mrs. McDonough, those who understand grouse moor management and the benefits it brings know full well that the real evidence shows that a ban on driven grouse shooting would make life worse not better, for the wildlife that the opponents of shooting purport to want to protect. And this issue needs to be debated on the facts and not on accusations motivated by a wider anti-shooting agenda. Because shooting, as others have said in this debate, is an integral part of environmental management and conservation. And it is the gamekeepers employed by shooting estates who make that happen. It is gamekeepers who maintain the habitat and control predators, which benefits threatened species of ground nesting birds. Grouse moor management has played a key role in maintaining our upland landscape and sustaining some of our rarest plants and wildlife. Far from being the barren landscapes that I've heard it described by some, grouse moors are incredibly important wildlife havens. Moors managed by gamekeepers, for example, support up to 5 times more threatened wading birds, such as the curlew. Merlin numbers have doubled on grouse moors over the last 20 years. 2020 was the best year for hen harrier breeding in England for 2 decades, and 60% of the nests where those birds were bred was on land managed for grouse shooting. I could go on with many more conservation success stories as a result of well-managed grouse moors by gamekeepers, but time for this debate is tight. And it's not as if grouse shooting is not already heavily regulated and controlled. There is extensive legislation in place that has an impact on almost every aspect of grouse shooting and grouse moor management, and licensing requirements are in place across the board. Any additional legislation would add to the cost and bureaucracy of grouse moor management, leaving our moors in a worse condition. And it's important to recognise the economic benefits that shooting sports bring to rural communities. Grouse shooting in the United Kingdom has a direct estimated value of £100 million, employing the equivalent of over 2,500 full-time jobs. Between 60 and 80% of direct spending from grouse moors is within the local area of that moor. It is of greater significance to the local economy and community retention than any other form of activity. And grouse moors, because they are managed largely through private investment of their owners, they offer the most cost-effective model of upland management to the taxpayer. And I genuinely wonder how those who make the argument, those who want driven grouse shooting to end, would fund and manage those vast moors, staff their management, and pay for it. Furthermore, grouse shooting brings the rural community together in areas that can struggle, as my honourable friend, the member for Ipswich, said in opening this debate, with social isolation and lack of employment. In addition to those shooting, a day's driven grouse shooting also involves a large number of participants, bringing together up to 50 or so members of a local community of all ages, all backgrounds. It underpins the social life of many communities and helps tackle rural isolation. So let's be really clear. Grouse shooting is good for jobs, it's good for the environment, it's good for species conservation, and attracting high quality tourism to remote rural areas, all without being a drain on the taxpayer. Those who are pushing for it to be banned have made no assessment of the ecological, social, or economic costs. And the evidence shows that the real conservationists are not those who call for grouse shooting to be criminalised. They are the hard-working gamekeepers who manage our moorlands day in and day out. And so those calling for a ban on driven grouse shooting need to set out a viable alternative, an alternative vision for our uplands. Our heather moorland is internationally important, and it is widely recognised that grouse shooting has helped preserve it.
Richard Holden.
Thank you very much, Ms McDonough, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'll try to be a little bit briefer than I'd planned, because there's lots of members who've made great contributions already, and I don't want to just reiterate what they've been saying. But I am very concerned about the petition today and the circle of destruction I think it would really cause for the rural communities in my constituency, and both economic and environmental, and I'm afraid I really can't disagree more with the petitioners, mainly because of the huge economic value that grouse shooting has to my constituency. But it's not just the shooting itself and the gamekeepers. It's the huge amount of part-time jobs that come during the season, and particularly for my hospitality sector, it's that huge amount of trade that comes with that industry, a sector that's been absolutely hammered by COVID over the last couple of years. And where we're really trying to push domestic tourism, particularly in places like the North Pennines and County Durham at the moment. We're not quite as well known as my honourable friend down in the North Yorkshire Moors. We should be, but this is a real area of growth for us, and something that we really want to capitalise on. And so I just think it's really important that we don't start to cut the legs off from under it just as we're recovering from COVID. I'd just like to make another point, really, which is that almost all of our landscapes are managed in the UK to a greater or lesser degree. And the danger of non-management is, as honourable members have said, is this huge increase that we've seen in wildfires. And that's the real danger which comes from the release of carbon into our atmosphere. Heather burning is an issue. When there's a wildfire which catches into deep peat, that really is an issue. And that's something that actually the proper management by gamekeepers and by the communities in my upland areas really help on. And one of the issues that I think is a major concern is that there can also be over-management, as we've seen in the past. The honourable member for Bristol East commented on, well, maybe there's more productive things we could do with the uplands. Well, we tried that back in the 1950s when we put grips in to the peat moorland to try and drain them to get sheep grazing on there. And what we saw was an ecological catastrophe with millions of tons of peat over succeeding decades being washed down the rivers and off the moors, one of the biggest carbon capture storages in the country. And I was lucky enough in January last year to have the Secretary of State for DEFRA up in my constituency, seeing some of those grips being filled in, so that actually we're seeing that peat returning as a massive natural carbon capture and storage facility. I also visited with my honourable friend for Bishop Auckland, her constituency, to see some of the very well managed moorlands, seeing some of the lapwings and the oyster catchers there on a recent visit. And I think it shows a degree of ignorance of the facts when it's quite clear that so many of these of the communities and so many of the gamekeepers who are working on these estates actually, one of the secondary things that they're increasingly looking to do is to support birding and people doing bird watching and that sort of thing. This is actually a major driver locally for a lot of people coming to the North Pennine moors as well. And I'd like to pick up on something that a couple of my honourable friends have mentioned as well, and that is of game itself. We need to obviously make more positive moves. I think steel shots is part of that in order to increase the reusable meat, but we also need to sell it properly as well. And I think that's something that very much that we as parliamentarians could definitely do, including here in Parliament. From Muggleswick in my constituency to Wearhead, I really support those in my villages who work on the moors, whether full-time or during the season. I support my local hospitality sector in North West Durham who really benefit from this. And I would ask the petitioners and those who support them to really think again about the actual economic and also the environmental impact what they're proposing would actually have on communities like those I represent in the north of England.
Thank you. Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Mrs McDonough, and a pleasure to speak in this debate with you in the chair. I don't accept that we should ban driven grouse shooting. I don't accept there's a willful blindness to some of the issues here. And I'd just like to point out to the petitioners, which I'm sure their concerns are very earnestly expressed, but I think there is in some quarters a blindness to the positive impact in terms of these particular areas on people, on the economy, on the environment and wildlife in terms of our management of grouse moors. So take it in turn, bad for people, I think the petition says, and as my honourable friend, the member for Scarborough and Whitby referred to, we jointly, our constituencies jointly cover the beautiful North York moors. And I really think, I fail to see how it's bad for people, the tens of thousands of people who enjoy the beautifully purple and green carpeted North York moors that, for their well-being alone, must have huge value, and the landscape would just not look like that if it wasn't managed in this way. I have been up to the moors on a number of occasions with the gamekeepers and looking at different parts of the moors up in my constituency, and you'll see the parts that have been managed. It is green, it is purple. There are areas of it that are left unmanaged as trials, and you'll see increased canopy, very grey, very poor in terms of wildlife in those particular areas. It is completely different. Left unmanaged, they just wouldn't look like they do today, and visitors would be far less likely to come. Of course, that would affect the farming communities, these communities are deeply embedded into the world of conservation. In my view, the people who understand conservation more than anybody else are the people who have lived in these areas all their lives, not necessarily the people who opine on this stuff from further afield. Also, it would be tremendous, as the point's been made before, it would be tremendously bad for the people who work in the supply chain and all those businesses. And the Honourable Lady of Bristol East makes a fair point. Maybe those people find other jobs. I really don't see where they would find other jobs to the level they have got in North Yorkshire. There's a huge amount of people that are employed in those hotels, in those restaurants, in their catering, in the caterers, in the beaters, the gamekeepers, of all different social strata involved in the whole economy around the grouse moors and grouse shooting. The direct, as pointed out by Honourable Friend, the member for Ipswich, £2 billion to the UK economy and 1,500 full-time equivalent jobs. So there's a huge benefit to people in constituencies like mine in terms of the wider economy and the well-being. So I don't accept it's bad for people. I also don't accept it's bad for the environment. As the point's been made before, these moorlands are rarer than rainforest, and they host a huge amount of flora and fauna, of course, but also wildlife. Again, those two patches that I saw when I've been up to the North York moors, the patches that have been managed, where you see a proliferation of curlews, golden plover, lapwing, literally teeming around those moors. Yet if you look at the areas that are not being managed, deliberately not managed as a trial, you see very little wildlife in those areas. So they are very conducive to wildlife. In fact, I think the statistic is there's 5 times as many of these very rare birds in the managed areas than the unmanaged ones. So a beautiful moor, obviously, estates up there, Snarlsworth, Bransdale and Spaunton in my constituency. They also have a very important role to play, has been mentioned, in terms of preventing wildfires, which can be hugely damaging, of course. The Climate Change Committee commented on this only this month, a report on climate risk. It highlighted the prospect of increased frequency and intensity of wildfire, stating that we can manage habitats actively to improve their resilience. For example, the removal of fuel loads that risk wildfire. That's what happens when a canopy gets too big. That canopy then burns and burns the peat. What the people who manage the moorlands do, they call cool burning, Mrs. McDonough, which takes away the canopy without burning the peat. And that's absolutely critical. So there's very little, in fact it's carbon neutral in terms of the new growth absorbs the carbon that's been emitted, but there is no release of carbon from the peat layer, which is hugely important. I think the other point in terms of CO2, which obviously we're all increasingly concerned about, but this is a report from the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. In terms of alternative uses for these moors, peatlands managed for cropland, grassland, forestry, for example, afforestation of moorland or fuel harvesting, emit many times more, around 8 to 39 tonnes of CO2 per hectare per year versus 2 to 5 tonnes in moorland. So it's quite clear that there are climate change benefits here as well. In terms of wildlife itself, Honourable Friend, the member for Scarborough and Whitby, is absolutely right. When I was a child, we never saw buzzards. I don't remember ever seeing a buzzard as a child, even though we spent most of our time outdoors in those times. Now there's a huge number, always circling in the sky. And some of the statistics around this is taken from the Spaunton Moor. George Windali, who is the representative for North York Moors to the Moorlands Association, in a single year, These are the sightings that are seen. 1,552 birds of prey, 10 hen harrier, 3 white-tailed sea eagles, 70 merlins, 193 kestrel, 16 short-eared owl, 163 barn owls, 84 peregrines, 14 marsh harriers, 1 osprey, 50 red kites, 57 tawny owls, and I could go on. 726 buzzards, a total of 1,552, extrapolated across the whole moor. That'd be 25,000 sightings of these very rare birds. Hen harriers, as I mentioned, numbers are on the rise. In terms of wildlife crime against birds of prey, absolutely right. The Honourable Member for Bristol East, absolutely right that we should work together to clamp down any kind of abuse like this, any kind of crime against wildlife. But the incidence is very, very low. No incidents at all reported in 2018-19.
I apologise for interrupting. Yes. Could I just highlight to the Honourable Member that there are 2 more members who wish to speak, and we're attempting to get to the wind-ups at 5:30.
Yes, absolutely right. And I'll conclude on this particular point, if I may, is that absolutely right we should clamp down on any wildlife crime, including against birds of prey, of course. One key thing, and I'll conclude on, is I know that Wild Justice were responsible for some changes to general licences, so making it much more difficult to control other types of birds, like gulls, for example. Gulls have a devastating impact on chicks, grouse chicks, on lapwing chicks, on curlew chicks. So we've got to make sure that any steps we take carefully and make sure those steps are evidence-based. Thank you very much.
Robbie Moore.
Thank you, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mrs McDonagh, and thank you very much for giving me the permission to be excused at the start of this debate, but I was also in the main chamber doing a private member's bill. The petition which we are discussing today states grouse shooting is bad for people, the environment and wildlife, whilst arguing it is economically insufficient. I'm afraid I must dispute this in the strongest of terms, and I'll outline my reasons as follows. It was just last year that Professor Simon Denny and Tracy Laverne Green of the Institute of Social Innovation and the Impact at the University of Northampton concluded a study, an economic study, looking at the social effects of integrated moorland management, including grouse shooting on moorland communities, and I want to share with you some of their findings. Firstly, of its positive impact on the rural economy. The direct economic benefit of grouse shooting is estimated at 67.7 million per annum to rural communities, and with the direct impact being thought to be as high as 2 billion to the country. In England, grouse moor management is responsible for over 1,500 full-time jobs, and of these, 700 are directly involved in grouse moor management, with a further 820 jobs in related services and industries. And this has a huge impact on rural communities, remote rural communities, which would otherwise have limited economic opportunity. And research has shown that the associated spin-offs from grouse shooting in the moorland, in the north of England, is worth an estimated 15 million a year, benefiting a raft of rural businesses. And these include game dealers, the hospitality industry, equipment suppliers and transport operators, many of whom are based in the most remote areas. Madam Chairman, one of the joint authors of this report concluded that grouse moor management is part of an integrated system of activities, and these include a whole range of things benefiting health and well-being, the economic prosperity of local communities. And that brings me on to my second point, the positive impact moorland management has on grouse shooting and the wider conservation measures, which include peatland restoration, carbon sequestration and improving habitats for many other ground nesting birds. There is more carbon stored in peat in UK moorlands than the combined forests of Britain and France. Therefore, careful management of moorland as part of grouse moorland management is essential to help preserve carbon being locked up in underlying peat. Grouse moorland managers have been actively working on a number of projects which include revegetation of bare peat and blocking up of moorland drains to raise water tables to encourage the growth of sphagnum moss, which helps the flow of surface water and filters out any discoloration. In the North Pennines alone, I know from my own experience, grouse moor management have blocked more than 2,500 miles of drain ditches and some 300 acres of bare peat, which have been revegetated with plenty more still planned. And research has also shown that where moors are managed by groundkeepers, ground nesting birds such as curlew and lapwings are 3.5 times more likely to raise a chick to fledging. And a survey of upland breeding birds in parts of England and Scotland has found that the densities of golden plover, curlew, redshank and lapwing are 5 times greater on managed grouse moorlands compared to unmanaged moor. And as my honourable friend, the member for Thirsk Malton, picked up, the mosaic of species of flora and fauna are widely known in grouse moorland managed land. But all of this is only possible where moorland is carefully managed, with the income gained from grouse shooting put back into helping cover the costs associated with managing the land, protecting that carbon storage. So to conclude, Madam Chairman, when discussing something like grouse shooting, it is vital to take a wide-lensed approach to the matter, rather than just looking at it from a headline political point of view. It creates jobs, it's good for the rural economy, it's good for the environment, it's good for conservation, and it's good for carbon storage.
I'd like to offer to Jonathan Gelongley 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mrs McDonald. I declare my interest as appearing the members of registered interest, as a game shooter and as a member of BASC. I think what I have found to be somewhat unfortunate in what has been a good-tempered and interesting debate today is the lack of understanding held in the premise of this petition, or perhaps an unwillingness to acknowledge that grouse shooting is all about working with the environment. Very specifically and directly on the moors where the game birds live and breed. Grouse are not imported. They are natural to their moors, and great respect must be given towards maintaining that environment, which is why these are magnificent parts of the country to visit. The environmental care for grouse shooting is very strong. And it seems that to argue otherwise is more about being anti-shooting rather than pro-environment. And I think the problem with the premise of the Honourable Member for Bristol East is that her premise was that this is about, and I think she said something about rich people maximising the number of birds to be killed for profit. Actually, very few grouse shoots are run at a profit. They are run by people who are passionate for their sport and about managing the environment. And that's about the peat and the other species and local jobs and preparing the ground for walkers and for tourists. So it's simply untrue to say that this is just about shooting game. It's about preserving for future generations some of the finest environments in the UK by effectively managing that environment. Thank you, Mrs McDonald.
Thank you very much, and thank you for making it a bit easier to chair, Mr. Junkley. So I think I'm right in suggesting that everybody can that Summers can have 9 minutes, and with 1 minute on the summing up. So if I could ask David Dugan for the SNP.
Thank you, Ms McDonald. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair, and I'm happy to see that this debate has received a substantive airing, and I'm grateful to the member for Ipswich for advancing it in his role in the Petitions Committee, and I understand and respect that he had no control over the title of this debate, which I personally find a little bit troublesome insofar as if I don't see things exactly the way you see, then I'm somehow willfully blind. Not very appropriate start to an important debate, especially one that's nuanced, such as this. Turning, Chair, to legislation, in a whole host of ways, the UK's bureaucracy and executive trails in the wake of Scotland's dynamism under 14 years of the SNP Scottish Government. You can take your pick from policy areas such as net zero targets, social care, reform, tuition fees, rates relief, tree planting, the list goes on. And this list includes the ambition for grouse moor management. By contrast, DEFRA's dead slow and stop approach to this challenge is unacceptable. It doesn't benefit anybody on either side of this challenging debate. In Scotland, the Independent Grouse Moor Management Report, referred to as the Werity Report, was published at the end of 2019 and took a comprehensive and consultative, evidence-based approach to key issues surrounding the management of grouse moors in 21st century Scotland. After careful consideration of the recommendations in the report, the Scottish Government will look to implement a licensing regime for grouse shooting, providing a framework to the sector which will assist them in combating illegal persecution of raptors and related wildlife crimes. Grouse moor estates found to be non-compliant, those who practice the types of behaviours that I don't think anybody wishes to see, would face the prospect of not having a licence, whereas those upholding the very best practices would see their practices and their behaviours endorsed and licensed as a legal and productive activity. These changes are designed to apply an achievable balance, and I know that the Honourable Member for Strangford talked at length about the importance for a balance, and other honourable members have discussed the need for evidence. Well, this is designed to apply that achievable balance between protecting wildlife and natural habitats, whilst also assuring agreed standards on grouse shooting are adhered to by business. The report, and this is very important, the report did not recommend that grouse shooting should be banned, consistent with their remit to ensure that grouse moor management continues to contribute to the rural economy of Scotland. But on heather burning, it did recommend that this should be subject to increased legal regulation applicable to all moor burning, not simply just on grouse moors. As with all good debates, there's pros and cons, there's positives and negatives, and the Scottish Land and Estates will maintain that raptor persecution on Scottish grouse moors has been addressed in recent years, and police recorded crimes are now at the lowest level ever. They'll cite evidence that predators such as foxes and crows are managed on grouse moors to maintain a favourable balance with their prey, and that this is scientifically proven to save rare and declining birds such as curlew, lapwing, golden plover, black grouse and mountain hares. And I know that many honourable members in the debate today, especially the Honourable Member for Scarborough and Whitby, have cited the recovery of some of these important breeds. The British Association of Shooting and Conservation will definitely share the views of Scottish Land and Estates, and they'll share their view also that moorburn supports other species and prevents larger fires from occurring. Both would contend that in moorland areas, grouse shooting is one of the most economically significant land uses, bringing in full-time permanent jobs and supporting local communities, and I know this currently to be so. Cons, of course, the League Against Cruel Sports would claim that driven grouse shooting is dependent on creating artificially high numbers of grouse in order to make it commercially viable. It's achieved by large-scale elimination of natural predation and the engineering of environments in their favour. The petitioners will highlight what they would suggest would be significant public support for an end to shooting of game birds such as grouse for sport. And they've cited, a figure has been cited, I've seen a figure of 69% of the British public in favour of a ban. But these questions need to be nuanced and contextualised for the consequences, not just the broad and bare ambition and aspiration. And just finally on the cons, the RSPB's annual bird crime report said that in 2009, 4 of the 5 worst areas in the UK for raptor persecution over the previous 10 years in Scotland were the Highlands, the Scottish Borders, Aberdeenshire and, I'm afraid, Angus. So in conclusion, Chair, the Honourable Member for Bristol East highlighted the lack of UK Government economic impact assessment. Well, that same absence isn't present in Scotland. The economic impact of this sector was set out in Scotland by research commissioned by the Scottish Government and published in autumn 2020 in the summary report, The Socio-Economic and Biodiversity Impacts of Driven Grouse Moors and the Employment Rights of Gamekeepers. The case study used in this published research showed that grouse shooting can generate significant economic impacts for communities, with impacts being generally localised. Reflecting on my own constituency of Angus, I know keenly, very keenly, how important the employment is on the estates for communities in the Angus Glens, for the schools, for the hotels, for the shops, for the petrol station, and the total absence in these communities of alternative employment means that the number of potential job losses is not as important as the effect of those job losses to these communities. And don't let anyone kid themselves on that this is an issue of just one job here or another job there. It's about the actual living viability of very fragile, very rural communities and economies. But no sector can operate in isolation, indifferent to the public opinion or the evolving nature of society and the revision of standards and normative behaviours. I think an honest assessment would identify that the industry has made improvements to its operating model as set out before, Chair. And this must continue, especially in terms of the challenges around muir burn, lead shot and losses to natural predation, particularly avian predation. But any demand for outright bans on established economic models with jobs and livelihoods of my constituents at risk leaves me very concerned, and reforms such as may be required need to be evidence-based and founded on consensus. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Olivia Blake will make her contribution remotely.
Thank you, Chair, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship today. And thank you to the honourable members who have made excellent contributions throughout the debate in a good-natured debate on a hot topic. I would like to thank the petitioners for signing this and the committee for arranging time for us to discuss this important issue. I have lived near the moors all my life, and I recognise their very special places, and is particularly special to my Yorkshire heritage. Inspiring great works of literature, songs and so much more, and we've heard so many members speak passionately about how the moors matter to them, from the member from Scarborough and Whitby to Strangeford to everyone else who's contributed. It's really clear that these are rich environments that people are keen to see protected. But perhaps it's an obvious thing to say that as a starting point to any sensible policy on grouse shooting, that grouse moors are not natural landscapes. They are a form of managed land, and how they're managed does have consequences for how we deal with the twin nature and climate emergencies. The UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. Protecting diversity, halting the decline of nature and restoring habitats and wildlife is a priority, not least because it is key to tackling the climate emergency, which I'll talk about more shortly, but also because it is intrinsically important to protect species and ensure wildlife can be enjoyed by everyone. Unfortunately, despite the efforts of DEFRA on crime, persecution and birds, it's still a huge issue. As a hen harrier champion, I feel obliged to highlight the hen harrier in the UK, one example of species under threat. As we heard from many members, between 2004 and 2016, the population dropped by nearly a quarter. And I'd like to thank the member for Bristol East for highlighting this. Natural England has shown that hen harriers are 10 times more likely to die or disappear on grouse moorland. That's something that needs to change. They found that 72% of birds that were tagged were either confirmed or extremely likely to have been killed illegally. Whilst chick numbers have been increasing, unfortunately, moorlands are still described as black holes for certain species. Since the brood management scheme was launched in 2018, a controversial scheme which removes chicks from their nests, a further 56 hen harriers have been killed, or their satellite tags have been stopped working with no evidence of malfunction. Most of these on or next to driven grouse moors. The illegal killing of protected wildlife, especially birds of prey and other predators, seems to be routinely linked to areas of grouse moors. So we need to make sure that we're doing more and more to put this action in place to prevent these crimes being committed. I think a sentiment that's shared across the debate today. I would also just like to highlight that this isn't just about hen harriers. A study of the Scottish Government found that a third of golden eagles fitted with satellite tags disappeared in suspicious circumstances. These are just a few examples of biodiversity being lost because the land seems to be managed to eliminate predators to provide more fertile grounds for grouse. But it's illustrative about how an illegal habitat management can damage species abundance. As I said, the nature and climate emergency go hand in hand. Last week, the CCC report was clear. Protecting our peatlands is a precondition for meeting our net zero obligations and mitigating effects of global heating we're already seeing. There is a huge amount of work to be done, and therefore there is a huge opportunity for jobs in our uplands in conservation. The majority of our peatlands are in poor condition, even in triple SIs, and the efforts needed to restore, as the CCC says, all of our peatlands is huge. Post-war draining and burning over the years has had huge impacts also on flooding. It is therefore rare to observe healthy peatlands that store water effectively. Rewetting our lands, peatlands, would not only be good for other species such as curlews, but also would help with flood prevention. That's why we must see an end to heather burning used to create suitable habitats for grouse. And I have to say, a number of colleagues that have spoken today seem to be a bit behind their own government on this, who have since introduced a ban, although I'll come on to later the limitations of that ban. We've seen huge amounts of carbon being leaked into the atmosphere over years of increased burning year on year. Burning releases roughly 260,000 tonnes of carbon per year, but that's compounded by the damage to the peatland that follows. Our degraded peatlands release 10 million tonnes of carbon per year. Not only does heather burning make the climate emergency worse, it also makes the effects more dramatic. We've seen that the damage to sphagnum mosses on the peat cause water to run off the uplands, taking peat with it, actually affecting the quality of our water that we have to spend a lot of money to clean up as well. Species loss, peatland degradation, and higher flood risks are just three costs of managing the landscape artificially. Despite this, the shoots remain almost completely deregulated. There are a few mechanisms to encourage good behaviour and very little to discourage bad, and the criminal activity doesn't seem to be ending. Whilst Labour have been pushing for the Environment Bill for a fuller ban on burning, alternatives like rewetting and cutting must be supported more fully to reach the full potential economically and environmentally. I think the idea that the grouse are ending up on our plates is also quite misleading. Only a very small number ever end up entering hospitality, unfortunately. And the use of lead is questionable, with small levels of exposure being linked to health problems, and even those just using lead shot can develop health conditions. That's why today I'm asking the Minister if she'll introduce licensing for grouse shoots in England, as is Labour Party policy. Licensing would provide another method to ensure these habitats are managed responsibly and that this system is more regulated. I would also ask what the plans are to phase out the use of lead shot in shooting, in grouse moor shooting. What plans there are to protect valuable non-bird species as well as bird species such as mountain hares, and if not licensing, what steps the government are taking to ensure that those who illegally killed protected species and other birds of prey and predators are brought to justice. What steps the relevant regulatory authorities, and this is something that hasn't been mentioned today, are taking to ensure that residues of other medications used for the kind of rearing of grouse are not getting into the wider upland environment, particularly as many of our environments are drinking water catchments. Finally, I'm pleading with the Minister in her response, rather than rattle off a list of initiatives that are loosely connected to peat. We've read the Peatlands Action Plan. I'd really specifically like to hear from the front bench what their government is going to do about the 60% of peatlands that remain unprotected from burning under the so-called ban that was recently brought into law. I'd like to thank members for how they've conducted this debate today. I know it's a very emotive topic, and thank you.
Thank you. I call the Minister Victoria Prentice.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's actually Rebecca Powell.
Oh, sorry, I'm just reading from my list.
This does come under my portfolio. There seems to be a little bit of confusion, but I am Rebecca. Just in case there's any confusion about that, but thank you very much. But it was because Minister Prentice's name was written on the details. But anyway, that's the least of our controversial issues this afternoon. Although I've got to say, I'd like to thank all members and honourable friends, and particularly the honourable friend who did his very clear and balanced opening, and I would very much thank him for that. And clearly there is a great deal of strong feeling about this issue, and people are coming at it from different perspectives. But I think everyone agrees that we want to protect our uplands and the wildlife that thrives there, and indeed the people that live there. And of course, grouse shooting, which is what we are talking about today, it does take place in one of our most iconic landscapes, the uplands, and it does compose of multiple habitats, dry heath, wet heath and blanket bog, and it is rarer than the tropical rainforest, and we do have a very large proportion of it in the UK at 13%, and it is very precious, and it does accommodate a wide range of activities, which you've heard about today, from hiking, all manner of forms of tourism, shooting grouse, grazing sheep and much more, and it provides a very rich habitat for many species and sequesters carbon, as the Honourable friend from Keighley mentioned, and filters out drinking water and helps us with our flood control. And the grouse shooting that many people inevitably get involved in attracts people to these treasured habitats, and they are engaging with this nature, which I see as actually a good thing to get people into nature. And the activity of grouse shooting does indeed bring jobs to the area. We've heard differing numbers from 1,500 to over 2,000 from different friends, and investment to some of the remotest areas in the country, particularly in the north of England, and that was flagged by so many friends. The Honourable Member from Scarborough and Whitbury, who has a great deal of experience from Strangford, and it is devolved, but it's the same issue. And similarly, also North West Durham, particularly about the whole wide tourism element, and the Honourable friend from Huntingdon, who summed it up so well. And particularly, it's the close working between land managers, stakeholders in key areas to ensure that the landscapes in these areas are protected both for conservation and shooting, and that they can work together for a sustainable outcome. So one of the ways in which moorlands have been managed for grouse shooting is by burning vegetation. This has been touched on by so many. The government has always been clear of the need to phase out rotational burning on protected blanket bog and move to a regime of cutting. There's been a lot of debate and discussion with stakeholders about that, and they're clear about that now. And that's to conserve these vulnerable, protected, the habitats on the protected sites of blanket bog. And there is established scientific consensus that burning of vegetation on these sites damages the environment in a variety of ways, hence the move to cutting. And the heather and grass burning regulations 2021 did indeed come into force on May the 1st, Madam Chairman, and this legislation represents a crucial step in meeting the government's nature and climate change mitigation and adaptation targets, including that legally binding commitment to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And we are, of course, aware of the Committee on Climate Change's views. This was flagged by the Honourable Member from Bristol East. And I did want to give assurances that we are taking peatland restoration extremely serious, as flagged by the committee. We had already allocated £10 million between 2018 and 21 that will lead to the restoration of 6,500 hectares of peatland. But we've also committed to a further 35,000 hectares of peatland restoration under the new Nature for Climate Fund, and we've just allocated the first tranche of that £50 million to be spent over the next 4 years for peatland restoration, and it will happen in lots of these areas that we're all talking about today, and that will be by 2025. So we have a very serious commitment to that, and we're making that very, very clear, along with all its carbon sequestration benefits included, as again was referenced by the Honourable Member from Keighley. But I will point out, as has already been alluded to, there are a few specific and narrowly defined areas where burning may be permitted on protected sites, and we've published guidance on this, and we're still working very closely on that guidance with everyone involved, because we do need to get this right for a sustainable future. And the issue of wildfires was rightly raised by many on both sides, and good points made, and it was particularly raised by honourable friends and members from Scarborough, Whitby, Strangford again, and Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner in particular raised this issue. And the government, of course, is acutely aware of wildfire risk presented by the dry conditions on moorland. Now, some of the clearest evidence points to the fact that improving the resilience of our peatlands to wildfire by ensuring that they're wetter and in their natural state is one of the ways, obviously, of controlling wildfires. But we have outlined in our recently released peat action plan that we would encourage all landowners and land managers to have good quality wildfire management plans to look out for this particular risk. And under the regulations, the Secretary of State may grant licences where he's satisfied it's absolutely necessary or expedient for the purpose of preventing wildfires, with the very careful management that will be required should that take place. So I wanted then to move on just to a little bit more about that Peace Action Plan, Madam Chair, which was published in May just gone, and it does set out our long-term vision for the protection and management restoration of our peatlands. So that is there for all to see and very clear about what our ambitions are. And I also wanted to say that in that we've got some strong measures in terms of delivering nature-based solutions, so that lots of the activities we do on peat will work towards this whole nature restoration move, and with obviously the important emphasis on re-wetting and working with the hydrology so that we get our moorlands back into their natural state. But in managing the moorland to create the optimum habitats, indeed for grouse, land managers can play a really important role in conservation for ground nesting birds in particular, and that's been referred to by many members. Heather moorlands are important habitats for some of our most iconic birds of prey in addition, such as hen harriers. And we have seen an increase in hen harrier numbers. That's been clearly highlighted by the honourable friend from Thursk and Moulton, from Buckingham, and a number of others. And we've also seen an increase in other bird species, for example, the buzzards and also the peregrines, and a whole range of others. But that's not to say that there aren't issues of persecution, and indeed I think we're aware that there are, and the government takes wildlife crime extremely seriously. And since 2016, DEFRA and the Home Office have contributed £300,000 annually to the National Wildlife Crime Unit. And indeed, as a backbencher, I campaigned for that, and the government has listened, and we're still funding that, and it's really important. And the police are very closely working on protecting our birds and the illegal killing of birds of prey with a whole regime that's in place. And I do hope that the honourable friend from the honourable member from Bristol East does welcome that funding. And the 5 species identified as of particular concern: the golden eagle, the goshawk, the hen harrier, the peregrine and the white-tailed eagle. And that work is very, very important. And in terms of wider biodiversity, our aim is to address the overall decline of species in England, and we will therefore be amending the Environment Bill to include an additional legally binding target which aims to halt the decline of species by 2030, and we're introducing a new species conservation strategies under the bill to help with that, and a green paper which will set out our framework so that we might better deliver species protection in the round. And I'm sure all friends and members will welcome that. And the Joint Nature Conservation Committee is working right now and making recommendations towards the end of this year on that. Just touching on the Werity review that was raised by the honourable member from Scotland, we don't have plans to introduce similar measures, but we are watching Scotland closely, and I think we can all learn lessons all round in whatever we do, and we will be watching to see how that proceeds. And so I will just wind up, Madam Chair. Of course, there are strong views on either side. I do welcome the fact that it didn't get really heated today. I think we do have to have understanding on either side. I hope as the Minister I do have that understanding in terms of what I would call looking after and protecting the environment, looking after and enabling our rural communities to survive and thrive. That's so important. And I suppose for me the key word in all of this, and indeed in almost everything I do in DEFRA, is sustainability. And I think, Madam Chair, I will conclude there. And thank you to everyone who's taken part.
Yeah. Can I thank the Minister and apologise once again for getting her name wrong. Can I call Tom Hunt?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So, I think the Minister and everyone who's contributed to this debate, well, there we have it. With respect to the petitioners, there's clearly not support in this House for the petition. In fact, there's probably less support than there was 4 years ago. What isn't clear is that banning driven grouse shooting would be good for the environment. In fact, I think on balance, probably it would be harmful. What is clear, what is very clear, is banning it would seem to be very little gain for a great deal of pain. And actually the pain, from what I can see, would be in those isolated rural communities, and the people paying the greatest cost wouldn't be the richest. but actually be some of the very people who right now we should be thinking about helping. So, I would after quite a balanced opening pitch, having listened to everything, I'd actually like to say I oppose, as an individual member of Parliament, this petition. Thank you very much.
Can I thank all the members who contributed to this debate for helping me in ensuring that everybody could speak. The question is that this House has considered E-Petition 266770 relating to grouse shooting. As many of that opinion say aye, of the contrary no, the ayes have it, the ayes have it, order, order.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order. Can I remind Honourable